Now, our subject this afternoon is love, human and divine, which is a very, well, I don't want to say it's a subject very close to our hearts. Oh, and forgive me, I couldn't resist it. But it's a really important subject. I think really nothing in life gives us more joy, and simultaneously nothing in life gives us more misery than our interactions with other people. We seem to always be on the cusp of one or the other of those realities. And we have to understand, in order to participate properly in this all-important aspect of life, we have to see it as most things, we have to see it from a very different angle than we're accustomed to looking at it. Swami Sri Yukteswar, who is the figure on the right as you look at the pictures, Sri Yukteswar is the direct guru of Yogananda. He didn't write very much. He was a very powerful and strong individual. For those of you who've read Autobiography of a Yogi, you hear about him. And he wrote one notable book, which is called The Holy Science. We don't have it back on our table because it's not a bestseller. And in fact, it's quite difficult to understand. I myself have read it a few times, but I still have to put it off for later. Some people are easily comprehend it, but it's not been a book I can get into easily. But he has a couple of ideas in there that have made a profound impression on me. And he starts with, the book is about the parallels between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the East. It's an East and West unity. So he talks about that statement of Jesus, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That's really quite an interesting statement when you think about it. And then he goes on to talk about what purity of heart is. Now, we have a sentimental relationship to the heart and love. And when Valentine's Day comes, we have heart-shaped things. And when we want to give each other loving presents, we make little hearts and we carve hearts on trees and put the initials in and all these different things that are related. We presume we're talking about our physical heart. When someone is greatly disappointed, we say that he has a broken heart. We rarely say that he has a broken elbow if he's been jilted by his true love or anything like that, because there is an esoteric reality that we're actually working with. And we're working with the chakras and the internal systems of energy and the way, as I was talking to most of you this morning, the way the karma is registered in the chakras, the way that karma is carried from incarnation to incarnation. The center of feeling inside of us is the heart chakra. It's not the physical heart, it's the spinal centers run through the center of the body, like as if there was a plumb line from the top to the bottom of the spine. As if have you ever made sugar crystals by putting a string into a sugar syrup and then you watch the crystals form around it? It's very much like that. The chakras are this straight line of energy, and then the physical body forms around it. It's drawn, the molecules the atoms are literally drawn into place, and the physical body grows from that. And each of the chakras, I spoke this morning about them representing different vibrations from pure selfishness to pure self-realization. That's a one way of referring to one aspect. But also each of the chakras has a completely positive expression of a certain quality. And the heart chakra is about feeling. And feeling is not merely incidental to our way of being. Sometimes people try to go much more by intellect, but feeling is our essential nature. When I was talking this morning about Sat Chit Ananda, ever existing, ever aware, ever new joy, Chit is about the awareness, the feeling that we have within us, that we're always experiencing not merely the ideas of things, but the I don't want to use the word emotion, the only word for it really is feeling, that we feel as much as we think. And in fact, how we feel is what influences how we think. How many of us, under the influence of perhaps distorted feeling, had very odd thoughts. We become very attached to someone. There's a story that Sri Yukteswar actually tells about his own life. When he was a young boy and he developed an affection, he said, for this very ugly dog. And everyone in his family tried to persuade him away from his affection for that dog, but there was no other dog for him except that dog. He'd committed his feelings to it, then his will, and all thought in his mind that dog was the most beautiful dog there was. When we grow to love someone, we often think they're the most beautiful in the world, don't we? I mean, everybody's baby is the best baby if it's your baby, isn't it? You know, no matter how homely or distorted that child is, once you love that child is beautiful in your eyes. That's the way we are. Now, when Jesus was talking about pure in heart, he wasn't so much talking about evil, but the purity of our feelings and the purity of the way our feelings allow us to perceive the world. And his statement, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, is what he is saying is, if we take away all those things that prejudice us against the world around us and prejudice us against people around us, we are suddenly able to perceive that everything in this universe is a manifestation of the same divine energy. You know, where do we think we come from? I was talking about that a little this morning. You know, each one of us, do you think that some of us are sort of manifested from the divine and others of us not? You know, some of us are made in China and some of us are made in India and some of us are made in the US. Where does that life force come from? Every being in the world has the same life force. This was completely absurd, but we were having a conversation in the kitchen of Kavita's house last night. And we were several generations of us and several nationalities, and we were all women, and we were all talking about our hair. We were talking about the color of our hair and the curl of our hair, and some of the men in the room started teasing us a little bit as if, you know, we shouldn't be having this, or it was a boring conversation. The concern was the Americans were boring our New Zealand friends. No, all women in the world, we can all talk about our hair endlessly. One of my dearest spiritual friends, we would always, first we talk about our shoes, then we talk about our clothes, then we talk about our hair, then we talk about our meditations and about God. It's just the way we're made. I'm just joking about women. Men can do the same. You know, we talk about the sports teams, we talk about whatever it is that we're interested in, but I mean, this was a silly example, but not really. You see African tribes women, and they've got the rings, and they've got their hair like this, and fashion is everywhere. People are the same. The more you travel, the more you begin to understand that all the differences are so superficial. And the one unifying reality among all of us is that we want to belong. We want to be part of something. And we want to feel that when we're with others in the world, that they can see us and that we matter. Isn't that true? And we also have this tremendous ability both to hurt and to help each other. I'm continually astonished, really, by both things. Even after all the years I've been on the spiritual path, I'm just amazed how a casual word, an inconsiderate thought, you know, a sudden lack of appreciation, a little bit of misunderstanding. It's so easy. And all of a sudden, you know, there's just this instinctive. What do? We instinctively pull back. We protect the heart, don't we? And how much we can help each other. Just a kind word. I worked when I was in my teens. I worked in department stores. I was part of a program where they hired high school girls and they put us in special costumes and made us seem like something special, but we were really just clerks in the store. And it wasn't my life to be doing something like that, but it was all right. But I would be dealing all day. I was not a town small enough where I knew anybody who was coming into the store. But just one person who came into that shop and actually saw me as an individual with a reality of my own and not just someone who was helping them shop. Just one person would change my entire day. It was just amazing to me. I would be happy all day long, and I would try to think why. It was because somebody had related to me, heart to heart, seeing me there. Of course, ever since then, whenever I shop, I always try to remember that the person behind this register has a mother and a father and children and a home, and they're thinking about, and maybe things are good, maybe things are bad, but their reality is absolutely no different than mine. When I would travel and just do simple errands with Swami Kriyananda, I would go anywhere with him, no matter how trivial or mundane the event, because I always learned something. And one thing that I learned from him, he had a very pure heart. And I'll explain more about that. I haven't forgotten Sri Yukteswar here. He had a very pure heart in this sense, which was he rested contentedly in the awareness of God's presence within him. And he was not needing to be affirmed by other people. Now, this is what the whole point of meditation is. We raise our energy to the spiritual eye, and we begin to understand ourselves to be one with a greater reality. And that doesn't disable our capacity to relate to this world, but we relate to this world from an awareness of our connectedness to a greater reality. What is it that causes us to be unkind to each other? What is it that causes us, to even hurt each other deeply? Because somehow, somewhere, I need something. And maybe I'm not getting it from you, so I'll get it over here. Or you're not giving it to me, so I'll be angry at you because you're not giving it to me. Or I'm unhappy and restless in myself, and I just forget that you're even out there. I have an acquaintance. She's very talkative and she's very interactive. But I believe she doesn't actually know there's anybody else out there. That's the only way I can describe her. She's very busy all the time, but your presence is quite incidental to her experience. It's one of those things where you kind of want to put on a gorilla costume and see if she notices when you walk by. It's just like all of her sense of herself is related to herself. What I'm interested in, what I'm doing, and she'll share it with you, but only because she's interested. Right? There's just no like this. I say that because Swami Kriyananda was exactly the opposite. His reality was he was completely at peace. And therefore, he could relate to this world from one of the principles I'm going to put on this board, which is, how can I serve? And what are we trying to serve? We're trying to serve, ideally, we're trying to serve the cause of God in this world. But how can I serve the cause of peace, of kindness, of compassion, of the diminution of fear, of comfort? How can I serve? But of course, we can only ask this question if the first question is, and how can you serve me? What do I need? And most of us do not have completely pure hearts. A great deal of our hearts are still hungry, to be verified, to be forgiven, yes.
Excuse me, what do you mean by serve?
Serve, how can I be of service?
Yeah, what do you mean by service?
Uplift, comfort, heal, inspire, give hope, peace, anything that moves a person away from suffering and more toward joy. In a way that's more than just, you can move people away from suffering and more toward joy by giving them 2 glasses of whiskey, but it won't last. Does that make sense to you? If not, I want to stay with it. It's a good question. Ask me in another half an hour, okay? Because that is the whole point. No, that's actually a very good question. I'll tell you just an interesting story from my own life. I've been married for 30 years, more than 30 years now, to a man I'm very fond of. He's a wonderful person, David. I'm a very self-aware person, and we got married in our mid-30s, and I'd been single for 10 years. And, so it wasn't like a naive, just sort of 19 years old, just hoping for the best kind of situation. And at that time, I was doing exactly the work that I'm doing now, and I had to organize a lot of trips and tours and things like that, which is just a nightmare of details. And you have to make commitments. You make commitments 6 months in advance, and you have to know exactly where you're going to be on April 27th, 7 months from now. And I really didn't like committing myself that far ahead. I resented it. I've gotten used to it, but I always wanted to have my options open. And so often I would procrastinate. I would come close, but I would procrastinate, and then I would just push it to the last. My husband is the kind of executive who believes in handling a piece of paper once. So whenever an issue would come to him, whatever the deadline, he would say the deadline is now, and he would resolve it. That's the way he has worked. He's just very good at that. He doesn't torment himself with indecision like I do. He just makes a decision, the decision is made. So he's watching me procrastinate, and things are sort of building up, and the letters are coming in, and I'm just not quite able to resolve. So he, out of goodwill, thinks that the only reason I will be doing this is because I don't understand the terrible consequences that are going to fall in my head. So he tries to help me, he tries to serve me, to be of service to me, by explaining to me the potential disaster I'm setting up. And of course, what he didn't understand is it wasn't that I didn't see the consequences, is that I was afraid to make the decision. So the more he told me the consequences of my action, the more frightened I became. Far from opening the floodgates of ability, I just became more and more paralyzed the more the world was described to me. But I had enough common sense to explain myself to him. And I said, I really don't need you to scare me. That's not going to work. It's not that I don't know. It's that I'm afraid, and I need somebody to comfort me and tell me that it's all okay and it's going to work out like this. And so with a very exaggerated sense of, yes, dear, it's going to work out, but also very sincere, he created around me a confidence in me that I didn't have. And as soon as I felt that faith, did I write the word faith? He inspired me, he gave me hope that in fact I did have the ability to deal with this, and I would. And then I found it much easier to go forward. Okay? Now, as it happened, the consequences of my actions were only going to affect me, but what if they were also going to affect him? If our hearts are concerned with ourselves, then we try to get other people to behave, not so much because it's good for them, but because we're afraid if they don't. And that is one of the ways that we confuse our relationships a great deal. This happens a lot between parents and children. Well, of course, between husbands and wives, wherever the lives are intertwined. We start telling them what they have to do, and we tell them it's for their own good. But what's really motivating us is our anxiety about what will happen if they don't. And children are extremely clever at sniffing that out. They can really tell when you're talking about them, and they can really tell when you're talking about yourself. Okay. Now, when your heart is, and of course I have to talk to you about what that means. I was coming back to Swami Kriyananda in this. He was always just so contented in himself. He had such faith that God would take care of things in their own way, that he could always just look at all of us, and over the course of years we became thousands of people, and many of whom he knew well. He could always just look at us and ask, what will help you? And I never knew him, in all the years that I knew him, to have a personal motive. Even in situations which I have been in on a number of times, where people's failure to respond to him caused enormous difficulties for him, he still had the same calm understanding that I'm not going to force my will on you just to protect me. I will try to inspire you, I will try to instruct you, but if you choose not to do so, then I trust that you're going to have to learn your lesson in your own way. Okay? Now, I'm going to come back to Sri Yukteswar and then I'll make that more clear. Sri Yukteswar, when he's talking about this purity of heart, he says it like this: the way we learn is with interaction with other people. And he describes like 5 stages, and I can't describe them all clearly, 5 stages of purification of the heart. The first 3 force us into constant interaction with each other. And only after we are very advanced may we retire into a cave and then just all by ourselves alone with the infinite sort of resolve the few remaining issues. The rest of us are compelled, and that's the word that I think is so interesting. We're compelled into relationships with each other. This is why as little children we want friends, as teenagers we want sweethearts, as young adults we want to get married and then we want to have children. Like, where is all of this coming from? You can say it's biology or whatever you say it, but Sri Yukteswar says it's God's necessary plan for us, that we cannot seem to move through life without embroiling ourselves with others, even from the start. Man and a woman come together to make us even happen, to give us, as Swami called it, the vehicle. The way Swami put it, which I think is very worth noting if you're a parent, he said, every soul has its own destiny, and that soul has to express its destiny. The mother and the father create the physical vehicle for the soul to express its destiny. But the parents do not create either the soul or the destiny.
Is that another principle, or is that the same principle?
Say that one more time.
Is that the same principle, or is that another principle?
What's a principle? The same principle. Oh no, it's separate from Sri Yukteswar. Yeah, separate.
I was wondering, how can I, so that's really a question, not a principle as well.
Yes, it's a question.
Well, you were saying what the principles are
Of, okay.
Heart, love, and we just wondering what they are.
The first guideline, I'll use the word guideline. The first guideline for success in your relationships is to ask the question, how can I serve? Now let me also add, you're not just serving the other people around you, you're also serving your own higher destiny.
That's like the priority.
That's the first principle. How can I serve the highest potential, not only of the people around me, but also myself? Because I'm going to call it a guideline. Can we just be at peace with it? Okay?
What about when can I serve? Wouldn't that not be a greater priority?
I'm going to ask that we put that question in abeyance for a minute because it's breaking it up into words too much. And I'd rather just go with the flow of it for a few more minutes. Can we try that? How and when. I can put when just as easily, but it's always how. It's the same. Can we pause? I'm going to lose my flow if I have to go too far with you, and I don't think that's fair to the other people in the room. So I'm going to ask you to just be patient with me for a few minutes longer. Okay, so the soul's destiny. And I was talking about parenting for just a minute there. All right. So Sri Yukteswar tells us that and the point that I was making about Sri Yukteswar was that our relationships with people are not incidental. They are, in fact, fundamental to our spiritual progress. Whether we enjoy them or not, whether they torture us or give us joy, they are fundamental. Because as Jesus put it, the final purification of the heart is actually when we're opened up to the experience of infinity. And those who were here this morning when we were talking about unlearned lessons and karma, a great many of those unlearned lessons are with other people. And the issue is simply this, it's like, how how can I become the full potential of what I was born to be? And what our interactions with other people tell us is they show us two things. Other people to us are always a mirror back of whatever is happening within ourselves. And so one of the ways that we find out who we are is by these interactions. I had a very good friend. She was perhaps the moodiest person I had ever known. She would just be so changeable. She got married. She had a very, very difficult time in her marriage. And she said, just before her marriage broke up, she said, "Until I got married, I never knew that I was moody." I mean, if you had wanted to put one word on that person, it was moody, but she never knew. But her desire to have a partner, to live with this man, which did not resolve very nicely, but she was always, suddenly she had somebody reflecting back to her. So we get to rub up against other folks and we get to find out. Now what I want to say about this is, inasmuch as the purpose of our relationships is to gradually purify our own understanding, the purpose of relationships is not that they're all going to work out nicely. The purpose of them, and they're going to provide an opportunity for us to expand our consciousness. And we can expand our consciousness in two ways. Swamiji made this very interesting point. He said, we learn a certain amount from having our desires frustrated. When we want something to happen and it doesn't come to us, whether that's marriage, family life, our children turning out a certain way. In the Jewish tradition, well, it's true of a lot of traditions, you know, you really want your child to accomplish, but there's a joke told that a rabbi was asked, it's a question that has related to do with right to life and abortion, but when does the fetus become a full human being? The rabbi was asked, and he said, when he gets his medical degree. When he becomes a doctor, that's the point. Ridiculous, but you know, these are the ways that we think, this is how we feel. We have these desires, and we want things to come out a certain way. And when those desires are thwarted, then, that was a lot of what I was talking about this morning, we get to discover within ourselves potentials that we didn't know we had, because we're forced to by the circumstances we find ourselves in. At the same time, we actually learn more, he said, from having our desires fulfilled. Because as long as a desire lingers and we haven't yet been able to experience it, the thought will always be in the back of our minds that if I had this, I would be happier. And if we're talking about transcending, you know, all limitations, if we're talking about pure bliss, the experience of God, the experience of infinity, whatever you want to call it, if I always think about I would be happier if, you know, I'd be happy to live only for the spirit, but I'd rather do it with Melvin as my partner, with Anita as my daughter, with my adult children living under my roof. Now, when we do experience, and by the grace of God, we do experience it. We experience wonderful partnerships, we experience beautiful children, we experience wonderful friendships, we experience guru-disciple relationship, many different things happen. Then we get to find out, you know, just how much happiness this will give us, and then we can move beyond. We can't renounce something, we can't expand beyond it if it's still holding us like this. So when you meet someone, and I'll use Swami Kriyananda as an example, he had this fearless capacity to engage in the world. You know, far from feeling he had to always protect himself from temptation and desires or anything like that, he was completely unafraid. And that was part of the purity of his heart that you experienced. It's like he knew that human love was wonderful. He knew that human life could be beautiful. And the great beauty of it was really the power of the divine beyond. And when he even looked at all of us, his comment once about, he said he saw all sentient creatures. That's not a word he used himself, but all beings, all people, even animals. He said, as egos at various states of development striving to be free. And here was another one that he often said, which I found, and I'll explain to you why I find it so helpful. He said, even when he would see people suffering, which of course is hard for anyone, and in the course of his life, people brought him every imaginable suffering. Just imagine what can happen in human life anywhere in the world, and it was brought to his doorstep. People wanting solace. You look to such a man for that. He said no matter how much people were suffering, he always saw it as a transition stage toward ever greater bliss. And even when the suffering was intense, the thought would come to him, how much greater will be their joy when they move through this temporary suffering into that eternal happiness. Now, talking about purity of heart, what happens to most of us? We see someone suffering, and either we don't want to have to deal with it. You don't see it so much in your country, but where I live, there's lots of people struggling on the streets, and not lots, but you see people struggling on the streets who are mentally confused, or drug addicts or alcoholics. They've recently closed down a lot of treatment centers in the state where I live, so there's homeless people on the street. You can still visit California, it's not that bad. But on a regular basis, you'll just see somebody walking down the street who's so miserable. And what's the natural reaction? The natural reaction is to look the other way. I just don't want to have to deal with this because it hurts us too much. Or we get frightened, or we get confused by it. Isn't that so? So another level of purity of the heart is, why should I be afraid? Some people are dangerous and you don't want to be foolish, but why should your suffering frighten me? And if your suffering frightens me, how helpful can we be to other people? Not everyone is ours to serve, and I'm going to go to that in a moment. We have our own destiny and our own people that we have to help. But if your suffering frightens me, how can I help you? And why would your suffering frighten me? Your suffering frightens me because my suffering frightens me. Isn't that so?
And what in New Zealand, people will rob you or will kill you?
You have to be appropriate. Okay? And the question of how can I serve and when can I serve has to do with this magic word, appropriate. Okay? Appropriate is, you have to do that which is genuinely helpful, not only to other people, but also to yourself. We are not more important than the people around us, but nor are we less important. And this is a great misunderstanding people make when they start trying to be loving. They imagine that if I martyr myself to other people, that is more loving. But that's not so, because it's not the truth. The truth is we are all exactly equal. We are equal manifestations of the divine. Some are wiser, some are more ignorant, some are dangerous, some are helpful. But in their essence, the same divinity exists in all of us. And when we fail to respect and respond appropriately to the divinity within us, we're not really serving others. They have a term for it in psychology. It's called codependent, don't they? Enabling relationships, where you are continually behaving wrongly toward me, but I'm just going to let you do that. I'm going to serve you by allowing you to continuously do the wrong thing. Is this appropriate? Okay.
How do you deal with Satan then?
Satan.
What would be the appropriate thing to do with Satan?
Okay, I in my life have actually had to deal with evil people. And when I've had to deal with evil people, I have to behave appropriately. And often that is to avoid their company, because their power to bring me down is much greater than my power to lift them up.
Is that serving?
That's serving, right. Because I can't help him, her, it. And if he is going to destroy me, I'm not serving him by letting him do that. And if I can't stop him, I need to remove myself from the situation. Okay, this has to do with we decide what's appropriate for us. I mean, many people have in their mind, you must serve the most downtrodden, the most difficult people in the world. But if in your effort to do so, you lose your own center, you lose your own joy, you lose your own sense of peace, then what you are really generating in the world is more confusion. It's not appropriate for you to follow that path. I was using it in terms of, if we're asking, how can I serve people? We don't necessarily serve their desires for us. We serve what is righteous. What is actually and truly helpful. And sometimes for ourselves, what we have to realize, and sometimes even what's being asked of us, because you see, fear of respecting yourself and standing up for yourself is also an impurity of the heart. This is what people misunderstand. They think the more I just denigrate myself and think that I'm worthless, but that's not how God sees you. And if you're calling yourself worthless and nothing, and I should be abused, and of course he should take advantage of me, or she should push me around, is that how the divine sees you? Humility, Yogananda said, is just honesty. Seeing things as they actually are. He said, for example, let's say you're a marvelous violin player, that you really are a very good violin player. Say you're the best in the whole country. Maybe you're the best in 5 countries. And that's a real accomplishment. So if someone says to you, well, there was this wonderful story about I don't know who he was, but a great violinist. Someone heard him play and said, oh, I'd give my life to be able to play like that. And the man said, I have. That's exactly right. And if you have, you have. And if he says that music was beautiful and you know that it was, you say thank you. Or you say, yes, I enjoyed it myself. It's a joy to play for you. I love to be able to be the instrument of that music. That's not being proud, that's just being factual. I had a friend who played the flute really beautifully, and every time I told her she played beautifully, she said, no, it really wasn't very good. She did this to me about 10 times, and I finally said, I compliment you and you insult me. I tell you played well, and you tell me I don't have any taste. I said, this is not humility. This is dishonesty. You did play well. Just say that you played well and let it go at that. But the humility comes from, well, so I'm the best violinist in the world. So I've given my life to playing the violin. 100 years from now, who's going to know my name? So I'm the best violinist on planet Earth. How many planets are there in the cosmos? How many violinists are there that I don't even know about? It's just like, I am what I am. I'm not more, but neither am I less. So love, human and divine, is also to be in right relationship to our own divinity. And for many people, that's the biggest challenge. And when we're in right relationship to our own divinity, then this is again what I was saying about Kriyananda, you're just at peace. And when people come in front of you, even if they have tremendous agitated energy, there's no part of yourself that becomes agitated with it. Now I'm talking ideals, I'm not talking about me or you necessarily, but this is what we're working with. And if we understand what the ideal is, then we can understand how to begin to work with ourselves. Okay, the first impulse we want to be is we want to be an instrument. Tambara sang that beautiful song of St. Francis, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is discord, let me sow harmony. Where there is lack of love, let me bring love to it. And what we need to understand is this is our true nature, and more than this is our assignment. This is why we are living in society and not alone in caves, is because our hearts need the fulfillment, and we also need to develop the skills to be able to do this, to be able to stand strong in the face of whatever comes and just hold on to this divine point of view. I think a few principles that we really want to be working with. Okay, what I was trying to establish at the beginning is to really understand that our relationships with each other are fundamental to our relationships with the divine. And that our relationships with each other are a fundamental way in which we come into right relationship with ourselves. And that all of this is one very complicated interwoven reality And it is the most tender and the most difficult thing that most of us have to do in our lives. It would be nice if it were easier, but for some reason it isn't. I think it's always confused me as to why it's so difficult, but I watch it in myself and I see that. And there's two realities that are always at work. One of them is the way we feel about ourselves and the dissonance we're trying to resolve by getting other people to behave in a certain way. And the other is exactly the same thing that somebody's doing, outside of you, with you, and to you. And if we begin to understand that we can learn and grow so much by all of these little interactions, I was starting to say a while ago before it went in another way. In my time traveling and being with Swami Kriyananda, I observed him always, whenever he found himself in any, I don't just mean he was stopping everyone on the street, but whenever he found himself in any interaction with anyone, he never considered that to be insignificant. It's like every interaction, and that's what I was saying about being in that retail store, we can put ourselves to sleep and then just fall into the world where it's just about me and what do I want, what do I need. But our life experience shows us that insofar as we insulate and close ourselves off, if that becomes our mental habit, then that's the life that we live, and we wonder why we end up isolated and feeling alone. But if we understand that at every opportunity, every interaction is the same opportunity to affirm two realities. One, the divine goodness in the person we're talking to, and two, the divine goodness within me. And when we also understand that this isn't really, up to me to do this. So when there was a man who came to visit our community, our retreat, and he'd been there just a few days, and he said to Swami Kriyananda, but he was also speaking about the community as a whole. He said, I have been here for just a few days, and I feel more love from you, from Kriyananda, he said, than I have felt from my whole family in my whole life. And then he looked at him and he said, you don't even know me. How is that possible? And Swami answered, the first part of the answer was, you're right. I don't know you. I don't know your personality. I don't know your history. I don't know anything about you in that respect. He said, but when I look at you, I see within you the presence of God. I see you as a soul on a journey manifesting the same reality that he has within himself, Swami has within himself. And he also said that I already love God. And so when I see you as a manifestation of that, I easily and effortlessly offer you the same love I offer to the divine. Now, we can work this from both sides. This is the topic, human and divine. We can learn to love God by learning to love other people. Or we can learn to love God within ourselves, and then we automatically love other people. And I think they're parallel tracks. So what do we mean when we're talking about loving God? Because it's not so easy. Some people are less clear manifestations of the divine than others, Some are bright, clear channels, and some are tremendously annoying. We had the fun of spiritual community, and I say fun is in quotes in this peculiar definition of fun. The peculiar definition of fun is the opportunity to grow and expand your awareness, is that if you take into account reincarnation, and if you believe that the relationship with the gurus goes over many lifetimes, and if you understand that there's a whole family of people who are disciples, and you're all on this journey together, and then you come farther into our Ananda communities and we're all doing this together. As I sometimes jokingly say, it's far worse than marriage. Marriage has a beginning and an end point, but this relationship with your spiritual family, it never ends. Literally, it never ends. And that one simply must learn to expand one's awareness and compassion and understanding, to appreciate that we're all doing our very best. Swami Kriyananda was once asked, there was this man who was the head of a project and he was so terrible at it. And somebody sort of was asking Swamiji about him, and he said, well, he's doing an excellent job given who he is. Which I've always really loved that. Given his inherent limitations and all of the karma and difficulties that he has to work out, he's actually doing pretty well with that. And one of the greatest lessons I learned, one of the ways that you relate appropriately to people, and I want to really help us to understand this, if you're dealing with someone who's 4 years old, and they bring to you the dolly, my dolly has a broken arm, you've got to fix my dolly's broken arm. You don't say, this is just an inanimate object, you foolish thing. You say, oh, poor dolly, here, we'll tie a little bandage on it and then we'll kiss it and it'll be fine. Because that's the appropriate response, isn't it? The child is learning compassion, learning imagination, learning how to relate appropriately, so you respond appropriately. A lot of times when we bring to highly evolved souls, I'm having trouble in my marriage, my child is not doing well. It's not really a lot different, but the master understands this is appropriate. This is what you need to be able to do. So he wraps a bandage about it and he kisses it and tells you it'll be well. A friend of mine was having a lot of trouble with their teenage son. Then the parents went to Swami Kriyananda and said, we're having so much trouble. We just don't know what to do with this boy. And Swami said, well, sometimes parents have to accept the fact that they just got a lemon. Now, he let them have that for a few seconds, just the actual possibility that this is really the best that this young man is ever going to do. Who am I to say that my son, my daughter, has to actually be someone of great talent and capability, or even goodness, merely because they're mine? Maybe you got a lemon. And he let them adjust to that for long enough for them to adjust to it, and then he said, but I don't think so. And then he went on to be encouraging. But that is a question in our mind. Merely because I need my son to get a doctor's degree from Harvard doesn't mean that that is an appropriate way to serve him. And the hardest thing, I think the single hardest thing in our close relationships, especially with people that we love, is to realize that they are actually separate human beings. And they have a complete trajectory on their own. I had a marvelous cycle with my dear husband who has a very strong will and does not use as many words as I do. And so when he has a point of view, he just simply holds it. He doesn't necessarily feel the need to justify it verbally to me. And I was, earlier in our life together, I was intent on him changing. Swami Kriyananda once said so perfectly, the tragedy of marriage is this, you'll follow this. He loves her the way she is when they meet and think she'll never change, and she does. She likes him well enough the way he is, but believes that he will change under her care, and he doesn't. And that's the way it goes. So I married a man with solid potential. He just needed me to mold him. I mean, that was a little overstatement, but not much. So I was molding him, busily molding him, and he was busily folding his arms and saying, in your dreams, honey, not a chance. And I was working very hard to encourage him in a certain direction. And how Swami Kriyananda found out about it, I don't really know. Because I don't think David would have complained. Maybe I complained. Imagine if David would just something like this. And Swamiji just said, I said, don't you think it would be good if he changed like this? And Swami said, yeah, that's, you're not wrong. He said, but you have to wait until he sees it for himself. You have to wait until he wants it. And on another occasion, I was in a kind of standoff with David. These were all in the early years. That's the only excuse I have. And we were sort of just in this standoff. It was one of those undercurrents that went on for quite a long time. And I said, finally, I interviewed him like a journalist. Do you know what it is that I'm trying to get you to do? Oh, yes, he said. I said, do you think it would be good for you? Oh, yes, he said. I said, well, why don't you do it? He said, it's not my priority. He said, I'm working on other things. Very instructive, isn't it? Now, how do we lose sight of that? Because we're so restless in our own hearts that we forget that the people who are close to us are not us. And isn't that annoying when it's directed at you? You know? So we have to ask, how can I serve? But we also have to be able to serve from inside the other person's reality in the direction that they both want to go and are able to go. Once in my life with Swami Kriyananda, he gave me a very good suggestion. I mean, I don't know, it's too late to say whether or not it would have been a good idea for me to follow it, but I couldn't. You know, I just didn't have the will. It wasn't even that I was rebellious, it just wasn't going to happen. This is a good idea, but it's not going to happen. And I wanted to be sincere with him. I couldn't live out of integrity. So I said, Swamiji, you asked me to do this, it's just not happening, and I don't see it happening. I don't think he took an extra breath before he said, well, so much for theory, let's deal with reality. And then immediately, and this was his genius as a leader, whenever I talk about human and divine love, I have to talk about him because everything I know I've learned from him. He had this genius for being able to figure out what you could do and then encouraging you to do something you actually could do. Because wherever you're standing, there's always a step forward. It might not be a giant step like this, and that's where the position that he, asked me, can you step that far? No, sir, I can't. Okay, well then what can you do? And when you encourage people to do things they actually can do, I mean, this is basic education. If you encourage people to do what they can do, they begin to have confidence that they can. And if you are the one who is always helping them to do what they actually can do, they begin to trust you as a friend. And then you really are able to serve them because they begin to understand that you are responding them according to their reality. This is how the relationships a lot of times between parents and children break down. I have not raised children, so I am not an expert on this, but I've been in community for a lot of years and I've seen it. A young man was complaining to me about his mother's anxiety about everything he did. And many of her concerns were true. I mean, things often did not work out in the way that he grandly proposed that they would. But his insight was very interesting. He said, but she fails to realize that I'm young. I have lots of energy and creativity. And what she considers to be a problem is not really a problem for me. It happens just as she predicts, but I just cope with it, and that's part of the adventure. We are not. Everybody is different. I remember when I was 18 and I was about to set out on my own and my father tried to show me how the math simply didn't work. The job wasn't enough, the rent was too much, how was I going to manage? And he was absolutely right. Except a whole lot of other things were going to happen and somehow I knew that. He didn't know that and he was very well-meaning for me. And fortunately he didn't insist. But you see, we also have to see it from that person's point of view. And appropriate is not necessarily to protect. Because people must go through what they go through. You don't own or create anyone else's destiny. They're out to have the destiny they have to have. Now, it takes a great deal of faith in order to really love people. You have to have faith in your relationship with a higher reality and theirs as well. And I was saying this a while ago about other people's suffering. When we are afraid of other people's suffering, our ability to help them is greatly diminished. And I think our fear of other people's suffering is a great reflection of our fear of our own suffering. And a lot of times when we're trying to protect those we love, it's really ourselves we're trying to protect, isn't it? It's just like, if you suffer, then I'm going to suffer, so I'm going to control your life so you won't.
So how do you change your suffering?
Say again?
If you feel that, I can see what you're saying, but if it is your own suffering, how do you deal with it?
First of all, one has to pay attention to the benefits of suffering and to realize that a great deal of the time we don't change until something happens that forces us to change. And that even though no one goes after pain deliberately, that often pain is the catalyst that expands our consciousness. As Swamiji put it, sometimes pain is the quickest route to an expansion of consciousness. So many of us have a rebellion against suffering. In fact, even Yogananda said he argued with Divine Mother, is how he put it. Why do you have to cause your children so much suffering? But he said he had to reluctantly admit that suffering was often the only way that people would wake up. So the first thing we have to understand about our own pain and our own suffering is look over the history of our lives and see if we can be honest enough to say that sometimes the greatest growth and the greatest benefit were related to the greatest pain. And this woman, I'll give you an example. She came to visit us in California from Sweden. She had a sister who was very close to her in age. And that sister got cancer at a very young age and died. And the two girls had planned their whole lives together. You know, they were going to marry, they were going to live near each other, raise their children together, everything, and then she died. When that sister died, her suffering was, her whole life fell apart. She just couldn't go on for quite a long time. But in that suffering, she was forced to think about life more deeply and more seriously. She was forced to gather her internal reserves in a way that she'd never even considered doing. And her compassion, her just many virtues developed, including a deep quest for truth, which is what brought her into my world. And then she was talking about all the things. She put it like this: I'd never prayed in my life, and I never prayed with any power until I had to. And as a consequence, this whole universe opened up to her that she didn't even know was there, and had to just completely redirected her life in a way that was far more meaningful. So I said, do you think your sister's death was a tragedy? And she had to stop and ask that question. What is death? Did her sister's soul continue? These are all things that she was learning. Her sister's death had been the catalyst of an extraordinary positive growth for her. So what was good, what was bad? What was suffering, what was not suffering? So yes, it's very, very difficult if someone is doing something that you feel, this is the way I think about it myself, it's very painful when you think the misery is preventable, but the person is determined to go on and do it anyway. And if they would listen to you, they wouldn't have to have it, but they have to run their own destiny. So now, what do I do? Or what if it is my own suffering, as you're saying? What if I have cancer? What if I have a terrible disease? What if many things have ended in disappointment? This is where the divine love comes in. Am I in the hands of a greater reality that is always working for my ultimate good? Or am I just the plaything of fate, and there's no purpose and meaning to my life? And no one can answer those questions except you. You can read dogmas, churches can tell you, I can tell you what Yogananda said, but until you take those possibilities and pull them deep in your own heart, and when no one is listening, you're answering that question one way or another. If you do not feel that you are in the hands of a loving, beneficent, greater reality that is working for your own good, everything is more difficult. So then you have to ask yourself, you just have to keep asking yourself over and over. That's what the whole spiritual path is about, is answering that question. And believe me, you answer that question over and over and over. And then you look to the great ones who inspire you, whoever or whatever they are, and you look at their lives and you ask, how did they deal with it? And you try to find that same within you. There's a story of Betsy and Corrie ten Boom. They were Christians who lived in Holland during the time the Nazis took over Holland. And they became a center house for the resistance. And they themselves housed and saved many, many Jews. And eventually they were captured. They were betrayed and captured. And both went to the concentration camp. And Betsy was the older sister, and she died. And Corey lived and has gone on to do many good things. She wrote a book called The Hiding Place, which described the place in their house where they hid the Jews. It's a beautiful story. But Betsy was always teaching Corey. Corey always felt she was the lesser, and Betsy died in the concentration camp. And Betsy said to Corey just before she died, and they loved Jesus, that was their way of being spiritual. She said, Corey, you must tell the world that no matter how deep your suffering, the love of Jesus is deeper still. And then she said, and they will believe you because you have been here. And so from all that Holocaust, Corey went on to inspire, faith, not just faith in Jesus, but just faith that no matter how deep the suffering, the love of God is deeper still. And that's what we're here to learn. We're here to learn that there is no limit to that. And is that easy? No. Not at all. Yeah.
I met Corrie ten Boom. She came to South Africa to talk at a women's fellowship, Christian fellowship. And the one thing that was so marvelous about her is even when she told about what happened in the concentration camp, there was no hatred, no bitterness. It was absolutely amazing.
Well, when she was at the end of her life, Betsy started to say, we must pray for these people here. Yeah. Corey assumed she meant the people who were prisoners, and Betsy meant the guards, because she thought their misery was actually worse. Because, look what they were capable of doing. What must they be like inside? And Betsy's heart, how can I serve? Because all she could feel at that point was just love. Behind everything, everybody is striving for the same thing. It's so interesting to me when somebody does something really strange that's incomprehensible to me. In my position, I have lots of interesting experiences. And every once in a while, someone will come and sit in front of me and say the most insulting things. Maybe they're trying to help me. I don't know. This man sat in front of me once and said, a lot of people find you inspiring, but I don't really find you inspiring at all. He said like that. My response, I was very proud of myself. I said, oh, you poor soul. I talk all the time. It must be awful for you. And that's really how I felt, because I was practically the only speaker in our whole temple, and everything that happened involved me, this poor man. Another man came up to me and just told me how, just how really rotten I was at the job I was doing, that I was such a terrible leader. And I told him, do you think if I knew how to do this job, I would still be doing it? Like, of course I don't know what I'm doing. That's why I keep trying, and you're the poor guinea pigs who have to suffer through it. But we're all in this together. And no matter what people are doing, it always seems like a good idea to them. And this was the way Swami would look at people. What are they really trying to accomplish here? And oftentimes that's what I try to figure out. When people behave very strangely, I try to think out, what are they trying to accomplish? From their point of view, what do they think this is going to achieve? There was this man, he was from New York, and he'd been raised very, very materialistically, very wealthy, very little love and a lot of stuff. He actually didn't know how laundry was done. He was raised with so many servants that he just dropped his dirty clothes wherever he felt like dropping them, and they appeared folded and clean in his drawers. It wasn't until much later in his life that he even found out about what a laundry was. But he was not raised well. And I gave a program, and I knew that he really liked it. I could tell by watching him. And he stood in line for a long time to speak to me afterwards. And then he said, it really would have been better if you'd explained it like this. And I looked at him and I thought, he's telling me that he liked it. It's just he doesn't know how to be nice. He only knows how to be like this, so he's just relating to me. And if you quiet yourself down and really try to listen, oftentimes people's hearts will talk to you. And here's another thing that you can really try, and this is very serious, especially when somebody's really in front of you. Everybody is guided by their own higher nature, the superconscious. the soul, if you want to call it. It always knows where it's going and what it's doing, even if what it's doing is making things a whole lot worse before they get better. Because sometimes you have to, if any of you are in AA or any of those things, you have to hit bottom before you'll come up. And sometimes people are not finished, and they've got to go out farther. But the soul always knows what is needed for its progress. So oftentimes when somebody bewilders me, I just quietly, without making a scene about it, you don't want to be really weird, you don't want to get this strange look in your eye and start, but just quietly in my heart, I pray to them. You can ask God to help you, but also ask them to help me. You know, what is your soul trying to accomplish? What is your what do you want from me? Not what do you want from me, but what do you want from me? What is the appropriate way for me to serve you? Often the most astonishing ideas will come to you. Just something it never crossed your mind to say, or just a way of opening the conversation that will suddenly lead, because you have moved out of my anxiety, my fear, my incompetence, my defensiveness, and have actually tried to live in their reality. The most amazing thing to me about everyone on the planet is that we all make sense to ourselves. You know, this gentleman was in the room earlier, and I had a hard time dealing with his questions, but he made sense to himself. You know, he was following a trajectory that was perfectly reasonable to him, and I just couldn't capture it. But he was very sensible to himself, and I wanted to, but it was too far out of the room. You know, I couldn't do it. But I know from his point of view, he was being perfectly reasonable. And everybody is, no matter how unfortunate our presentation may be. Swami had this wonderful expression. There was this person who was so difficult, and Swamiji said, yes, she does have a rather unfortunate manner, doesn't she? And I just love that. Yes, a rather unfortunate manner that doesn't bring to her the results that she wants. But if we can just see that this one is no different, alone in his room, alone in her room, it all makes perfect sense, and she's trying to get just where I'm trying to get, which is into this state of union and understanding. And what I was saying earlier about my husband, you know, I tend to like words, I like reason, I like ideas. I work best with people who are on my wavelength. But sometimes people just aren't. And then you just have to go to where they're trying to go. And sometimes all you do is just create energy. Swami, this was one of my favorites. In America, you know, naturally, like in many countries, you need visas. If you're from other countries, you can only stay a certain amount of time. Before 9/11 in America, there wasn't a big computer system, and lots of people who wanted to be at Ananda in America from Europe would just come in and out at a fairly random basis, overstay their visas, leave again. We were able to play it pretty fast and loose. And this one woman from Italy was about to marry an American. This was her last illegal trip. And she had a return ticket that was dated prior to her arrival ticket, which was, she'd just been using the same return ticket for a while, and this time they noticed. So she gets trapped by the immigration people, and you know, this is her last illegal trip, and her fiance is American. We really want her in the country. So she's there. Swami hears that she's trapped. And he had a very big voice, and not loud, but just big, very big aura. And he goes down to the immigration place, and he just walks in and he says, I understand you're holding a friend of mine, like that. And he says, she's a wonderful woman, you know, an excellent cook. She makes this dish, and he talks about like that, and he says, have you been to Italy? I've spent a lot of time in Italy. Italians are such wonderful people. You would like it there. And he just created all this and pretty soon the man's laughing with him, and they're talking. It's like just created this whole positive aura, and he released her. They never discussed the issue, the ticket, the visa, nothing. He just went in and loved the man. And it wasn't a trick. It was just, you know, there you are, we're all on the same side. I know you have a job to do, but let's just go this way. You know, sometimes that's all people are asking from you. They're not really asking something reasonable, they just want to be seen. And sometimes if you just see them, you've accomplished everything that there is. The man behind the counter, and then your own child. Oh, I know what I was going to tell you. This woman called me one day because her son was in college at that time, and he had left his diary open in his bedroom, and she read it. And he was writing about the fact that he realized that he was gay, and what was he going to do about that? And he was the only son of his mother. You know, what's mother going to say? He was writing about the necessity to come clear with his mother, but how was he going to do it? Now, she's read his diary, which of course was a no-no, but now she has. And she also knows that he's going to be talking to her, and she is just panicked. She's not even so much, she had a certain reluctance to accept that this was going to be his life, but it wasn't even that, it was just, she just didn't have any idea how she was going to deal with this. So she comes to talk to me, you know, we sort of have to work this out a little bit. And she said this phrase, "I just don't know anything about this." I said, well, that's a wonderful starting point. You don't know anything about this. Your son knows much more than you do about this. You don't know anything at all. Just because you're his mother doesn't mean you have to know everything. So the first thing that you need to say to your son when he brings this up is, gosh, I don't know anything about this. Why don't you talk to me about what you're really feeling? Now, isn't it the tendency to say, well, I want you to understand, and what's the concern? The concern is myself. And he did come, and she did exactly that. She rested in her own heart, in her love for her son, and simply recognized that she was way beyond herself. I said, if he was a total stranger, that's how, if you were sitting on an airplane, and a man said to you, you know, I've just realized I'm gay, I'm going to have to talk to my mother, you would have a very different conversation, wouldn't you? You would just listen to him because I don't know anything about this. And the mother and son had this conversation, at the end of which the son said, never in a million years did I imagine I could talk to you like this. And they just went through it, remained close, you know. That could have been a division point if she hadn't been able to say, what is appropriate, how can I serve you? What is appropriate is, I gave you the vehicle to express your destiny, but I'm not creating your destiny. And I want you to marry that lovely girl, Margaret, you know, who's so nice and has lived next door to us and who you like so much, and you can have beautiful babies and I can be their grandmother. But who am I serving? Whose life is it? Very, very tricky, isn't it? But how do we want to be regarded? We want to be seen for who we really are. And when you give that kind of energy, you're also creating a universe in which that energy exists. That's your magnetism.
Is it what is Julie want to see between unconditional love and how can I serve you coming from the purity of your heart, and sometimes letting them go through their own karma?
Unconditional love, yes, means that my love for you, my happiness is not based, and my love for you is not based on how you behave. But I always like to condition unconditional love with appropriate. Because sometimes when people think of unconditional love, they think, therefore, I just have to do what you want.
So it's just become a real handy term.
It's a very handy term, and it's a good term. Because what it's really saying, and here's another one that's a really good word, which took me years to understand. You have to be impersonal in the way you love people. And impersonal does not mean that you are not regarding their person. You have to be impersonal about yourself in it. You know, we are souls together. When I first met David and I was thinking about our getting married, and I had all these ideas about how I wanted to be married and all this, I realized that merely marrying would not create anything. Either we were friends or we weren't friends. And that's just a very important thing in all our relationships, this woman with her son. Either we're friends or we're not friends. Just because I'm your mother, you're my son, we can be like that, but we're either friends or we're not friends. And I had this wonderful picture in my mind. We lived out in the country then, and there were these wonderful night skies. It was very, there wasn't much moisture in the air, so the stars during the phases of the moon, certain phases, it was just exquisite. And you'd see these little stars, you know, like this. And that's how I began to think about my relationship to David, and that's how I've thought about it all this time. We're two little stars, you know, up there, and we happen to be really close to each other. So we have a really good time because we get to shine a lot together. And that's just a beautiful way, that's an impersonal way to think about it. We're each little dots of the infinite, and that's where the unconditional comes from. What is there not to love? You know, everybody is striving for the same thing. What is there not to love? Some personalities are highly unfortunate. There was a person in our community who was very difficult to get along with, and a woman was having a lot of trouble with him. He didn't last in our community, I have to add. A lot of difficulty, and she came to me and she wanted me to do something because I was in charge at that point. You know, you have to do something. And she gave me a long list of true complaints against this person. All of them were true. And so I said, here's an idea. We have this big open area in our community. The apartments where we live are all built around a garden. I said, let's take him out into the center and let's shoot him. Because then we won't have to deal with that unfortunate personality anymore. He'll just be gone. Isn't that a good idea? Because that's actually what she was suggesting. You know, make him be different. No, we can't. And if we condition our love on whether or not people please us, we're going to be very lonely, aren't we? And many people don't please us, and then therefore we have to be appropriate because we also have to think about ourselves. You know, if I know that I can't handle this person, I will try not to be with them because I won't be able to serve them. I will be very inappropriate. I will constantly be trying to execute them so that I won't have to be irritated, even though I don't have the capacity to actually execute them, but that's where you're going. You're trying to expunge them from your universe. And always, what bothers you in others is what bothers you in yourself. It's just an infallible rule, especially if you judge it.
Sometimes just acknowledging who they are is an appropriate way to serve them.
Yes, it's an appropriate way to serve them. And you don't have to spend your time there if you can't do it. You can leave it to someone else. Yogananda, there's a story where he was talking to some very narrow-minded religious person who was attacking him for being not an American Christian. I mean, that was basically what the man was upset about, is he had the audacity to be born in another country and then to come to America. And Yogananda tried for a time to reason with him, and finally it was hopeless. And they were on a train or in some public place, and a lot of people were listening. And Yogananda took off his hat, and he said, I bow to the colossal temple of ignorance in front of me. And then he put his hat back on and went on his way. And everybody who was listening just cheered. I mean, at least it was an appropriate thing to say. That was a colossal temple of ignorance in front of him. And it was so colossal that he had to honor it. And sometimes that's just the way you have to be. And then you go away. But why allow it to disturb your peace? You know, even the evilest people in the world, and this is more challenging, but still they're going to follow their destiny, and you don't have to take care of their karma will take care of themselves. And somewhere deep inside, there was a public enemy number one. I can't remember his name, Dillinger, I think was his name in America, and he was literally hunted down by the police and shot. And when they found his bullet-ridden body, he'd written a note that says, I am a much misunderstood man. Within this body beats a heart of goodness. And he'd been horrible. But from his point of view, that's who he was. And when you, as much as you can, either in person or from a distance, project that upon people, it has a stunning effect on them. There's a tradition in India that says, one moment in the company of a saint will be your raft over the ocean of delusion. This is the concept of darshan, which is the presence of divine light. Now, that can be a superstition. And when Swami Kriyananda was in India, literally, people would fall at his feet so that he couldn't progress. You know, he couldn't progress in and out of a hall, and they had to have ushers lined up like this, just literally holding people back so that he could walk through, because the belief had become so much that if I can touch the feet of this holy man or put my child in front of him, everything will change. There is truth in that. I mean, Jesus went through the crowds and changed people's lives. I mean, if the man is great like that, I'm not saying that Kriyananda and Jesus are the same, but the principle is there. But here's the real power of it. When you're with someone who sees you in your potential, and not as a technique, you can do it, but just looks at you and sees your potential. All of a sudden, it just becomes your own. I'll tell you one more story about Swami before I stop. I met him when I was 22, and he was 43. And of course, that gap remained. And I was just starting out, and he was very immersed already in spiritual teaching. I was a very opinionated person, and I never hesitated to express my point of view, to my uttermost embarrassment as years passed, but I always did. In all that time, Swami always listened to me attentively, took me seriously, and more often than he should have, let me have my way. And years passed. I'm 43, I'm 63, I'm working with people who are 20, 30, 40 years younger than me, and some of them are very opinionated, and some of them insist on their own way, and sometimes I was tempted to say, you're just an inexperienced twerp, do it my way. Because I'm not always as good as I would want to be. But before I said that, I had to realize that, of course, I'd sat in front of Swami Kriyananda and insisted in my rash youth, and he had always respected me, and not once did he ever refer to my age or inexperience. Never. He always just took me as I presented myself and treated me as a peer. So I went to see him the next time I saw him, and I said, Swamiji, I really want to thank you. I said, for just putting up with me and never using, your rank or your position as a tool over me, never referring to my youth, I said specifically. And he accepted it graciously, but he had this look on his face that I knew was only part of the story. And he said, and this is what he said, I never noticed. He said, I never notice how old anyone is. He said, the soul is ageless. Think of reincarnation. You don't know who anybody is. He said, I just look into their eyes and relate to the consciousness that I see. So there's so many levels. I could discipline myself, but he didn't have to discipline himself. That's just what he perceived. He sees consciousness in front of him, even animals. We're all just on a spectrum moving forward. He says, how can I serve and what is appropriate? And as a rash youth who needed to feel the power of my own intelligence, he knew that what was appropriate was as much as possible within reason to let me have my way. And he didn't. He was impersonal. He didn't have anything at stake. He was just there to serve. Think in terms of the ideal. Recognize that we can't meet it, but move ourselves toward it. And there's another expression, the instrument is blessed and changed by the high ideals that flow through it. So the one who is most benefited by all of that is ourselves. So, anything else before we? Would you like to sing Many Hands Make a Miracle?
Sure.
Seems like a nice song.